Welcome to Worldview India, Mr. Nabil Shaath. Bomb blasts in Bombay, in Srinagar, in Najaf, the UN headquarters in Baghdad, in your part of the world, Palestine, Israel, Chechnya. What is happening?
Well, what is happening is really very destructive and extremely lethal. And some say a new world order is being born every year and has not yet seen an equilibrium that brings in real stability. Some say it's a world with one big country and one big leader, and there's no more that equilibrium. But the Americans see this as being immoral. They claim that any equilibrium means continuation of confrontation, but confrontations continue on many scales. Some of them justify, some of them are not, and I'm not justifying terrorism. I'm saying that labeling a proper struggle for independence as terrorism really makes a big mistake in both ways. Waters down the meaning of terrorism and takes away the right of people to struggle against an occupation that brings terror and forces people through arms and through weapons to submit to the will of an occupier.
But how do you end this? I mean, if the retaliation is going to manifest itself, if, say, popular movements or what used to be in the 70s and 80s national liberation movements, if they are going to manifest themselves in today's context as acts of terror, then the whole world will be horrified.
Yes, and to that extent, if you go back to all our statements as a Palestinian Authority, we have condemned every bus incident, every mall incident where bombers have hit civilians, and we consider that to be negative in pursuing our goal of liberation. But what I am objecting to is to generalize from these incidents to label all our resistance. The Israelis even call our children throwing stones at Israeli armor terrorism. And I think the situation has to be clarified on that regard. Israel is an occupier. It has killed 3,500 people in the last 2.5 years, 80% of them civilians. Most of them died as a result of what properly is collective punishment or attempts at using mass military means to catch few suspects of bus incidents. All those civilians killed are labeled.
Then there seems to be, is there light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, we have, or you have, Mr. Ariel Sharon on the other hand, whose popularity doesn't dip and who takes a very tough line on the whole issue of Palestine.
When there is confrontation and when people die, then people unite around the ruler, rightly or wrongly, to get them out of that situation. I mean, this is a phenomenon that has been clear in history. We do not really at all see our struggle as continuing to lead to deaths on both cases, and that's why we are seeking a peace process. And we feel that once a peace process is on, the Israelis might have a different mind about Mr. Sharon.
Is it on? Is it on?
The peace process?
You know, let me just change the question a little bit. I met Mr. Larson, the United Nations representative, and he seemed to talk of a quartet. He says there is us and there's the Europeans and then the Russians. And then I come back home and I find that there's no one there except possibly the Americans. So this quartet is a mirage? Is it some sort of a facade? What is it?
No, at a certain moment of time, particularly in preparation for the American occupation of Iraq, America felt a need to get a bigger community of nations on board its attempt to broker peace in the Middle East. And at that time, the Europeans, the Russians, and Mr. Kofi Annan were ready to provide that opportunity. and therefore the quartet was born. The birth of the quartet in the Middle East was a very unusual phenomenon, as the United States never accepted participation by other parties in the Middle East in particular. It accepted other parties in the Balkan, in West Africa, and so on, but never in the Middle East. Accepting the role of the quartet, from our point of view, was an excellent development, because it meant really getting closer.
And now what has happened? It has been diluted and it has been put on the shelf. It has been diluted, and it has not been allowed to participate in the single most important aspect of that endeavor, which is the monitoring on the ground. But we have not given up, and that opportunity might come back again. The members of the quartet haven't given up trying to keep that role alive. And in fact, as the United States is seeking now a bigger international role in Iraq, the quartet is encouraged that it might seek the same again in the Middle East. You brought in the question of Iraq. How is the American predicament in Iraq impacting on your peace process?
In both ways, really. And this is the nature of events. I mean, you cannot predict exactly that they are they have just one effect. They might have others, some of them intended, some of them unintended. Right. But for sure, if you look at what happened immediately after the end of the conflict with Iraq and Kuwait in 1991, and the proclaimed end of the conflict by President Bush in Iraq in 2003, few days after, both George Bush the son and George Bush the father initiated a peace process in the Middle East. This cannot possibly be a coincidence. It is really a linkage, and that is, when the United States achieves conquest by war in part of the Middle East, it sees a need to have victory in peace and not only in war, and finds the Holy Land the most appropriate quest for peace in the Middle East. It's also because of the centrality of the role of war and peace in Palestine and Israel to the whole stability of the Middle East. A centrality that was made clear in 48, 67, 73, and 2003. And so in a way, there was a positive effect on Middle East peace because of the events in Iraq, the tragic events on Iraq. And the way now it goes the other way around, because really of the possible effect of what's happening on Iraq on President Bush personally and his preoccupation with that problem. But once the Americans go again towards the United Nations in Iraq, that might push back a positive multilateral role on the Middle East. I still remain optimistic that by and large, the American policy now directs itself towards achievement of peace as a requirement for American strategy in the Middle East, but also for the personal strategy of President Bush.
That entails going to the United Nations again. Do you think that the neocons in Washington are likely to go to Kofi Annan, cap in hand, and say, well, actually, we throw up our hands, now please pass a resolution?
No, this did not happen exactly that way, but it happened in a muted sort of way. I mean, the first attempt of the United Nations to go to the Security Council after the formation of the interim governing council in Iraq was a timid attempt at starting dialogue with the United Nations. Now, that timid attempt might go further as we go along, and if the increasing dependence on the United Nations produce beneficial results, both to Iraqis and to Americans, this might be pursued. I'm not so sure how will it go, but definitely I see the direction of a multinational approach towards Iraq as well.
In the first phase of the Iraqi resistance, I mean, which was characterized sometimes as the Ba'athist resistance, it was Iraqis versus the Americans, and American soldiers were getting killed, they were dying of thirst, they were committing suicides, and there were stories of horror and tragedy were being relayed back in the United States. Now, with the UN being bombed and with this Najaf, it again becomes the universal struggle against terror. How does that equation affect you?
It does. It does. Whatever one really has to see in these events, and maybe they are totally unrelated, yet because of 9/11 in the United States and the aftermath of 9/11 and the attempted hijacking of 9/11 by the Israelis to dump upon the Palestinians, you cannot totally ignore the effect of what's happening in Iraq or Palestine. That is why we need to get out of the confrontation as quickly as possible, in order to get out of that labeling and of the whole incidence of bus bombings and anti-civilian activities from our side, and the continued killing of civilians by the Israelis on the other side. We want to get off that road as quickly as possible.
Supposing I wish to visit Palestine, I want to go to Gaza, Ramallah, how do I get in there? I mean, how does one come to visit Mr. Nabil Shaath, Foreign Minister of the Palestinian Authority? How does one do it?
It's very difficult. You probably will not be allowed into Gaza anyway. The Israelis have stopped all foreigners from going into Gaza, had prevented foreigners from leaving Gaza, had warned foreign residents of Gaza that if they leave, they will not be allowed again. And the reason is they don't want anybody in the world to see for himself what's going on in Gaza. They don't want any human rights activists to go and put their bodies between Israeli bulldozers and Palestinian houses. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult for you to go to Gaza. Even it would be probably less difficult, but very difficult to go to Ramallah or to Nablus or to Jenin. The Israelis are making every hurdle to prevent foreigners from coming to Gaza, to help or to support.
How do you come in and out?
It took me 7.5 hours to cover 90 kilometers between Gaza and the River Jordan. And you get stopped everywhere. You get stopped in the Erez Junction going into Israel. You got stopped again going into the West Bank. You got stopped quite long in trying to go over the bridge from Jericho to Jordan. It's a difficult time. Israel is besieging every Palestinian town and every Palestinian village.
So therefore, for the so-called international free press, there is no way for us to get in there. So I suppose we have to be embedded on one side to cover the story.
That is correct. That is correct. Or else use Palestinian reporters wherever they can go and Israeli reporters whenever they can.
There's no help that you can accord, say, a journalist from India?
Really, we do not control the passages. We do not control entry into Palestinian towns and villages. And that's why it has been really very difficult for journalists to come in from the outside. And there really grew a group of young Palestinian journalists who are now representing most foreign press in the West Bank and Gaza. In the past, we have no problem for Israeli journalists coming into the West Bank and Gaza, but it's very difficult to send Palestinian journalists into Israel.
India, what role for India? Where do you wither India? We were great friends in the days of non-alignment and a bipolar world. Now, dynamics have changed.
The dynamics have changed, but I don't see why it should affect India's relationship with Palestine. It affects definitely India's strategy for its own achievement of its own objectives. It makes India closer to the United States without really being far away from Europe or Russia. This closeness with the United States has so many objective reasons.
And Israel?
And Israel for certain commercial and defense reasons. I mean, we cannot really in any way be against whatever India finds as a sovereign country its interests lie, so long that neither India's relationship with Israel or India's relationship with America or India's relationship with Russia lead to India abandoning its principled position on matters that have been so important to India from the beginning of its struggle for independence and justice and from the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, Indian principled support of the right of the Palestinians for self-determination, the right of the Palestinians to end Israeli occupation, the right of the Palestinians to have their own state ending Israeli occupation, all of those are matters that need not be abandoned in India's quest for prosperity and defense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaath. Thank you very much. Just one final question I should have asked you. Any hope in hell for this peace process? Do you see light at the end of the tunnel? Not in the near future.
Well, pragmatically, I would have really been satisfied if we were able to end the first phase before the American elections. The first phase would have ended Israel's reoccupation after the year 2000, would have ended Israel's outposts of settlements created after 2001. It would have frozen Israel's growth of settlement activities, would have brought in an international conference, and would have installed a ceasefire ending the siege of Palestinian territories and releasing Palestinian prisoners. All of which would have been a good step that could make us wait till the end of the American elections and probably an emergence of a new Israeli government to pursue permanent status negotiations.
So until between now and 2004, November, we are marking time.
If we achieve the objectives of the first phase, we would not be marking time. Because if this had happened, if between now and November 2004, we have a real ceasefire installed, end of settlement activities, and a re-functioning of all the agreements
You don't see that happening, Mr. Shaath, do you, frankly?
Hard, difficult, hard as nails, as the Americans would say, but I think obtainable and achievable, and we've got to work as hard to obtain it as we can.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.